When I was a young girl, I remember learning the adage, when you settle for less than you deserve, you get less than you settle for. And I can't think of a better situation to apply it to than dealing with the regime in Iran. We're inching closer and closer to a deal with a partner who is inching further and further away from compliance. At least in 2015, under the first Iran nuclear deal under President Obama, the Iran regime at least pretended to show some restraint and a softer tone under then Iran President Hassan Rouhani. But this time around, they know Washington wants that deal. Remember, President Biden and VP Harris campaigned on getting back into a deal. I don't remember hearing any conditions or good arguments for getting back into the deal. There was just one thing. Trump got us out, so we have to get back in. There's a civil war going on in the United States, and well, the Iranian regime is definitely benefiting. So now, under President Raisi in Tehran, a hardline butcher, as he's referred to, the Iran regime gets to have it all. The bad behavior, a meaningless nuclear deal that won't hold them to much, and of course, the removal of hard-hitting sanctions. Look, the Iran regime has carried on its bad behavior for decades. Ever since they came into power in 1979 and overthrowing the Shah of Iran, they've made it a priority to spread their brand of extremism throughout the region and the world. They created terror proxies like Hezbollah. They funded terror groups like Hamas and Palestinian Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen, the insurgencies in Iraq, the Basijis and the Revolutionary Guardsmen in Syria, and not to mention the dozens of suicide bombings and now cyber attacks that they're carrying out throughout the globe. And if you think they're conducting their shady business far, far over there in the Middle East, for the past decade, they've been fixated on beefing up their assets in South America at our doorstep, with heavy influence in Brazil and Bolivia and Venezuela and many other places. And if this weren't enough, the Iran regime is now threatening Americans right here on U.S. soil. They've carried out high-profile cyber attacks on significant infrastructures, and they brag about enriching uranium up to 60%. So any logical person would now ask, why are we at the negotiating table in Vienna with an unwilling partner, and why are we the ones who are begging them for a deal? If you won't take my word for it, listen to the thousands of Iranians coming out onto the streets protesting a fraudulent government and a corrupt system. And if they don't want the regime, why are we the ones working so hard to legitimize them? What's this deal for? Is the administration just nostalgic for Obama era policy? Are they so attached to the Obama handbook that they can't divert? If they're not working in the name of regional and global security, and if it's not for the people of Iran, then who will this deal benefit other than a bunch of mullahs in Iran and their terror appendages around the world? Lots and lots of questions. And we're fortunate enough to have the perfect person here to try to answer them for us. We're joined again by our good friend and friend of the Foreign Desk podcast, Victoria Coates. She's the senior fellow for the Center for Security Policy, former senior policy advisor to the Secretary of Energy, deputy national security advisor for the Middle Eastern and North African affairs under President Trump. And before that, national security advisor for Senator Ted Cruz. And of course, what many people don't know about her, she's brilliant, she's beautiful, she's eloquent, and of course, PhD in art history from the University of Pennsylvania to boot. And she's the author of David Sling, A History of Democracy in 10 Works of Art. Welcome back to the program, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Good to be with you.
Victoria, well, I have you here for so many reasons, right? Originally, I wanted to ask you about two major headlines that we have about Iran today, this week. But that was all eclipsed by the news that you, personally, Victoria Coates, were named along with 50 other advisors and military people who worked under President Trump by the Iran regime. You have been sanctioned, basically, personally sanctioned over the 2020 killing of military leader Qasem Soleimani. How does it feel to be sanctioned by the Iran regime?
Well, it is something of a badge of honor, I will say. They sanctioned us for what they referred to as terrorism and human rights violations, which is rich coming from one of the world's largest engager in terrorism, and also one of the world's largest human rights abusers. So the whole thing was something of a farce, but at the same time, it shows how little good faith they have in what they're theoretically engaging on in Vienna. I mean, for them to do this to a bunch of Americans as they're negotiating by proxy with the current American regime, it shows you who they are. and the Biden administration doesn't want to hear it.
Right. So it's like they're in a very dysfunctional relationship, right? So imagine you're dating someone who's showing you all the red flags, and they keep showing you more red flags, and they're saying, if you don't believe me, here's something even more egregious. And like you said, it just keeps getting worse, both at homes in terms of human rights, obviously in the region, by supporting so much terrorism, and now at home they have actually named Americans. And so Jake Sullivan came out over the weekend and said there will be severe consequences if any Americans are attacked. Does he mean this? And are they really worried about any, God forbid, assassinations being carried out on U.S. soil?
Well, they should be today if they weren't over the weekend, because the Supreme Leader posted a video to his personal website of an assassination attempt on former President Trump. And I mean, you can't get more blatant than that. You know, the ruler of another country posting a video of your former president being assassinated on the golf course. So, you know, they are sending the message loud and clear. And I agree with your analogy. It's as if, you know, you have all of these abusive signs and yet you want to go waltzing in Vienna. And you can choose to decide, because Vienna is beautiful, that everything is fine, or you can look at what's really going on. And so, as I said, I welcome National Security Advisor Sullivan's statement. It would be nice to have some outreach from the administration, some inquiries about our personal safety. None of that has been forthcoming.
Right. And, like you said, there have already been, you were quoted actually in a CBN piece saying, that we've seen examples of this before, whether there have been assassination attempts or kidnapping attempts. Activist and journalist Masih Alinejad, there was a foiled plot to kidnap her. And she's working obviously in DC and New York on U.S. soil. We've seen the bad behavior. So why the empty threats? Meaning, if the Biden administration is going to go forth and excuse all this bad behavior and forget the inconvenient truths of, as I've always called them, of what the Iranian regime is, then why not just go forward with that? Why are they now, they're almost answering symbolic threats with symbolic threats? We're gonna, you better not. But meanwhile, they have, and they continue to.
I think we also have, one of the things that's fueling what you're rightly identifying as a disconnect is the fact that we have a structural problem with what's going on in these negotiations, which is that the Iranians from the about this time last year refused to just talk directly to the Americans. So we are negotiating by proxy. So think about it this way: the Chinese and the Russians get to talk to everybody, but we don't. And by doing that, the Iranians have symbolically isolated us. They've also made us dependent on interlocutors to carry our messages, and with various issues of translation and whisper down the lane. I mean, even if the administration was sending a really strong message, I don't know that it would be easy to convey it, because the Biden administration preemptively surrendered direct negotiations. And maybe you do that for a day or two and then say we're leaving unless you guys will meet directly, but they never did that.
Right. And I want to go back to what you referred, because that's one of the big stories I wanted to discuss today. Speaking of hypocrisy, we have big tech, and in this case, Twitter, the incestuous cousin of the White House right now, who over the weekend we saw this tweet come out of the threat being made against former President Trump. Former President Trump really got under their skin, didn't he? I mean, whether it was the killing of Qasem Soleimani or the sanctions that were truly hard-hitting for the first time, they want to take revenge, but Twitter thinks it's fine. I mean, they took President Trump off of Twitter, but it's okay for our enemies to use that platform to convey all the threats they want.
No, there doesn't seem to be an Islamist terrorist that's too foul for Twitter to actually ban them, while a former president of the United States is fair game. And I just couldn't agree more strongly that this is really a disgrace that this is allowed to stand. And I certainly agree that with President Trump, the Iranian regime had an American administration that would keep them off guard. They weren't sure what was going to happen next. And I can speak from personal personal experience that he was completely sincere in his offer to meet with them. But again, he wouldn't do it by proxy. He was like, if we're going to meet, then I'm going to meet with the supreme leader. He understood that Rouhani and now Raisi are simply stand-ins for what the supreme leader wants to do. And so he was very clear, if you, the true leader of Iran, would like to meet with the true leader of the United States, we will do that. And they will be with no preconditions. They, of course, thought it would be ducky if we lifted all the sanctions, in return for some sort of lower level meeting. But that wasn't what he wanted. And he then followed up with actions that made it clear that their actions had ramifications, that there would be consequences. And, when they killed contractors and continued shelling civilian ships, and that was when, the president made the decision about Qasem Soleimani, and then they really knew there were going to be consequences.
Since you did work behind the scenes, I know you said it perfectly, that the Iranians didn't know what was coming next. I think President Trump appeared to be, all over the place and maybe erratic, maybe in his tweets, but perhaps not in his policy, because he had people like you and others working behind the scenes to come up with a solid and sound policy, particularly when it comes to Iran. What was, if you could briefly summarize, what was the short and long-term game plan vis-a-vis Iran in the White House under Trump?
Well, the president was very clear that he thought the JCPOA was a terrible deal, one of the worst in history, because his goal was to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That was always first and foremost in his mind. And then he wanted to stop them from having missile systems to deliver those weapons, and he wanted to deter them from deploying regional terrorist proxies. And so, as he understood it, the problem was that even with the sanctions that Congress had put on, some from the Obama administration, but mostly through Congress, there was a reduction in Iranian economic activity, but that was being offset by smuggling, by the waivers that had been put on for South Korea, India, China, Japan. So they were still exporting a lot of oil. And, as a business guy, the president understood that if you wanted to stop them from sending $900 million a year to Hezbollah in Lebanon, get rid of the $900 million. And that is one of the great strengths we as the United States have. If you give other countries up to and including China a choice between doing business with Iran or doing business with the United States, around the world, the choice will be the United States, because, Iran has very little to offer. So that was the genesis of the maximum pressure campaign, and which was bearing tremendous fruit, giving us enormous leverage over the Iranians. And then what you started to see with some kinetic actions, particularly, I should have mentioned the attack on Saudi Arabia on Abqaiq in September of 2019, that the United States wasn't just going to tolerate this. You couldn't just punch us, and we would just, ask for more. You can dance right up to the line, but when you step over it, then we're going to whack you, and you're not going to like it. And that, interestingly, after the Soleimani action, there was not a peep out of Iran for quite some time. After the Biden administration came in, we saw a dramatic escalation of activities, particularly out of Yemen, but also in Lebanon and Gaza, which I don't think they would have dared if President Trump were still in the White House.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And speaking of using President Trump as the boogeyman, it's not just in Tehran, it's here in Washington as well. There's a scoop overnight by Axios. We reported on this at the Foreign Desk today as well, that talks about how two sources talked about now going forward in the next 2 weeks, the Biden administration feels like it's going to be do or die at the negotiating table with Iran. So their strategy for the next couple of weeks will be focus the fire on Trump. And that's a quote. They're going to focus the fire on Trump, meaning they will convey to the Iranians that it was all of Trump's fault for getting out of this deal, the 2015 deal, and putting us in this mess to begin with. So let's work together to build it back, meaning they're willing to step on a former US president, an American president, in order to get closer to our enemies.
I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And, I think we can expand this out to what's been going on over the last couple of days with the vote on the Nord Stream 2 sanctions in the US Senate, led by my old boss, Senator Cruz, in which the White House deployed teams of senior administration officials basically to lobby the Congress on behalf of Russia, to lobby the Congress not to do this. And in this case, they're basically saying the former Trump administration is a bigger enemy than the Iranian regime, which is just bizarre. And I think they need to take a good hard look at this and realize the enemies that we have include the Russians, the Iranian regime, not necessarily their fellow Americans. And I was very heartened to see former Ambassador Dennis Ross lead a group of all Democrat former national security officials in a statement out earlier, I think last week, saying that the United States needed a credible military deterrent to Iran. This is all Democrats saying that this administration had no credible deterrent and they needed one if they were going to have any kind of effective diplomacy. So the administration might want to look around, see it's not just the evil Republicans who have this kind of a policy, but it's a lot of very responsibly minded Democrats as well.
So, let's get down to the root of this. Why? I mean, in 2015, we can go back to 2015 because it looks like this administration doesn't really have any ideas of its own, that they're going back because it was struck in 2015 by the almighty President Obama, and then President Trump withdrew. So then we must do the 180, right? We must get back in. But why? Are there any real concrete reasons in terms of policy that this administration thinks we should get back into that deal?
I think in a way it's a lack of policy. I think they are not interested in the Middle East. For them, the Middle East, it exists solely to have fossil fuels. They're not terribly enthusiastic about the alliance with Israel. And given left to their own devices, they would be very much about pushing this extraordinary socialist agenda here at home. That's where they want to focus their energies, their resources. They want to remake American society in this kind of sort of socialist mode that will make American citizens very dependent on the government, which they think, to be charitable, I assume they think this is a good thing for some reason. Now, what that results in, because you can say, I'm not interested in the Middle East. You can say, I don't like fossil fuels and we're going to have wind and solar. But unfortunately, that's not reality. So we had this sort of pitiful spectacle on the eve of Glasgow of the big UN climate hootenanny of the American president basically begging the Saudis to pump more oil, the same Saudis that he has denigrated and insulted at every turn. Then suddenly he's accusing them of being the reason that Americans can't drive to work because prices are too high, not because of his completely irresponsible energy policy and his alienation of one of our great historic allies with whom a new future of energy cooperation is entirely possible. But they threw that all away. So I think what you're seeing is really a lack of policy. The default option is get back in the JCPOA. Then you've checked the Middle East box, and we can go back to build back better.
Build back better, right? So what should we expect? 1 year down, 3 to go. What should we expect with regards to, first of all, Iran policy, and secondly, Middle East as a whole? Are we gonna, maybe we can talk about the Abraham Accords a bit, but what are you seeing?
Well, I think the best we can hope for from this crowd is a policy of benign neglect, that they could just stay out of it. On the ground, organically, good things are happening. The relationships between the UAE, Israel, and Bahrain, for example, growing relationships with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, these are all great things. Morocco, of course, in Northern Africa. And hopefully that can expand. There was a report yesterday that Libya is considering normalizing with Israel. What a wonderful idea. How much help could Israel be to getting Libya back onto a stable footing? So, that's all really positive. None of it is happening because of the administration's efforts. So hopefully they would just stay out of that. and so I think that is the best we can hope for. My great concern is, and this may be something you want to talk about more in depth, is that what the Iranians have done over the last year in terms of developing their nuclear program since President Trump was out of office has perhaps gone beyond the point of no return. Once you know how to build an enhanced centrifuge, once you've enriched up to 60%, it is a very small hop to 90. You can't put that knowledge out of somebody's brain. And they, of course, have no interest in doing that. So if they've spent this year developing the capability to achieve a nuclear weapon, then it's their choice when they choose to deploy that capability. And, then you're not just in a bipolar world where, Iran and one of their neighbors might have a nuclear weapon, sort of like India and Pakistan, because it's not going to stop there. And, many of our Gulf allies have been very frank that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they would be irresponsible towards the security of their own citizens if they did not also pursue nuclear capability. And where that ends, nobody knows. Because if you suddenly have 4 or 5 nuclear powers across the Middle East, it's an extremely unstable game. And I don't know who could control all of that. And, accidents happen. Situations get out of control, escalations happen. That's a really dangerous world. And that would be my great concern looking forward.
Yeah, it looks well. France is concerned that this is not going fast enough, right? Because they want to wrap it up and put a little pretty bow on it and go back to Paris to eat their croissants. And of course, the Biden administration has already kind of has already unlocked all the locks, right? So they've put into place, instead of 60%, we've moved to 90%. It used to be that snapback could mean any transgression, but now it has to go up to 90%. So they basically have to be on the 1 yard line in order for us to say, wait a minute, which, as you mentioned, would be too late. So it looks like it's not a matter of if, but when this deal is announced. What recourse do we have after this administration, if there should be either a more center-leaning Democratic president or maybe a Republican one? What recourse do we then have to get out of another nuclear deal?
Well, it's an interesting question. I might take a small issue with what you said about the French. They're not just I'm sure they are going back to eat croissants, but they're not just going back to Paris to eat croissants. They're going back to Paris for a presidential election. And so you have President Macron, trying to position himself as an international statesman, a bringer of peace, et cetera. The other thing that I'm sure has not escaped any of your listeners' attention is the fact that there's going to be an election in the United States in 10 months. And the Iranians are also watching that very, very closely. And the problem with all of these shenanigans in Vienna is if they do not pass whatever Frankenstein version of JCPOA comes out of that negotiation, if they do not pass that either through the Senate as a treaty or through both houses of Congress as a law, there is nothing that protects it from a future administration. And there are going to be all sorts of intellectual gymnastics that will go on trying to give the Iranians what they're asking for, which is some kind of guarantee of the durability of the deal. There is no such thing. And every private company that even considers going into Iran on official projects, in energy infrastructure, all the stuff they desperately need to have done, and which I would love to have American companies leading the way on with a future Iranian regime. But if anybody goes in and starts those projects, they are doing a grave disservice to their shareholders, because there's every reason to expect that in November of next year, or actually January, when the new Congress is sworn in, that one of their first orders of business is going to be to reimpose every sanction that is available to the Congress. And then a future administration can simply do what President Trump did and withdraw from the deal. I mean, technically what you do is you cease compliance with it because it was never signed. And this notion that the United States gave their word, no, that's what a treaty is for, not something that's implemented by the United Nations Security Council.
Right. And for those who, and this will be my last question to you, I sometimes wonder what people think, because we have so much hypocrisy in this country, right? We just talked about big tech's hypocrisy. There's so much media hypocrisy, right? So they'll talk about women's rights, but when it comes to the women's rights in Iran or Afghanistan, there's silence. They don't talk about it. They don't ever want it to upset the image that people have of what's going on at the White House. So we didn't do anything wrong in Afghanistan, of course, and we have to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. So we definitely don't want to talk about their human rights violations. We know that the Iranian regime was pining for President Biden to win this presidential election over President Trump. I mean, obviously the media is complicit in painting the picture that they paint, but where are average Americans on these stories? Is it just because we're, avoiding foreign policy? Do people not care? And I get it. There's so much going on in this country that, people, they're worried about the school board meeting more so than what's going on the floor of Congress. But, how can we get people's attention, not just on foreign policy, but on this hypocrisy, on the fact that if we believe one thing, that should carry out that standard, that value should carry, on into other places, and we should see things for what they are, like the Iranian regime.
Well, I think that's where truth tellers like you, Lisa, are so critically important to bring other perspectives, to your listeners and viewers, and to hopefully an ever wider audience. Human rights is a great example of one of sort of the conundrums of making a national security policy, which is, of course, for the United States, we stand for human rights. But we can't do that at the expense of our national security interests. And what the Biden administration has done is case in point. They have abandoned the women of Iran, they have abandoned the women of Afghanistan, while trying to withhold military support for the government of Egypt based on 13 journalists that either have or have not been detained, whose names they won't release. And I'm not saying press freedom in Egypt isn't important. It is, but is it worth sort of in a draconian fashion, just cutting off the national security of the United States without at least getting sort of clear answers about what actually is going on? And so I think we always want to retain human rights as a tool and something that we can use to bring hope to the afflicted, freedom to the oppressed. That's been our history over our 200 plus years, and we can continue to do that while also defending the United States. And so I think they've been sort of reverse selective. They've focused on small, sort of murky things and missed the big picture on human rights. But just finally, in terms of the American people, people have long memories, and a lot of people remember 1979, and a lot of people remember all of the bad deeds of the Iranian regime, and they know that they're not our friends. And I would say increasingly we see in the midterm races a focus on some of these issues. China is a major issue. China has major implications for the Middle East. Israel is a huge issue. People don't understand why we wouldn't be embracing our great ally, Israel. Why are we being harsh and punitive towards them? And so I think maybe they don't know all of the complexities of what's going on in Yemen, but that's the job of policymakers to keep it that way. But I think on the big picture issues, they do understand. And that is a great opportunity, I think, for people who do cherish and celebrate the national security of the United States to communicate that message.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Victoria. I can go on and on with you. Brilliant and articulate, and you break down these very difficult to understand subjects so well for us. You're always welcome to come back to our show, and I hope that you will very soon. Perhaps we can talk about China next time. And until then, do follow Victoria on Twitter. She's wonderful. She tweets a whole lot of important and informative tweets. And to follow us here at the Foreign Desk, you can subscribe to our podcast at youtube.com/Lisa Daftari. And to sign up for our daily top 10 list, you can go to foreigndesknews.com, and we will see you all next week.